Hello and welcome to a new series on the channel called Where to Start. You've heard about a TV show or you've heard about a book or a video game series and you don't know where to start them. Everybody talks about how good they are, but which one do you start with? Do you start with the original? Do you start halfway through? Do you start with the new thing? In this series, we're going to attempt to answer that question while going over brief descriptions of every one of the shows or games or books in the series so that hopefully you'll be able to find where you want to start. This is not a you have to start here. This is not a watch order. This is just recommendations and telling you what each show is about so that you can choose where you want to start. Today's episode is on Gundam. As you can see, we're green screened in, we're zoomed in really far, and I'm wearing my Gian shirt, which unfortunately the Beam Saber is getting green screened in. This green screen has given me all kinds of trouble today, but that's okay. We're going to get started with Gundam. And of course, we're going to talk about original Mobile Suit Gundam first. First Gundam, I've did a whole Twitter thread on this, which is what I'm going to be using, and I'll probably do a Twitter thread on each one before I record a video on it. But First Gundam, really, really solid show. It's about I'm going to try not to just read off my deal in Twitter that I said. It's about Amuro Ray, who, due to circumstances, is ejected from his colony and has to fight a battle in the Gundam, the giant robot, to try and protect people, to try and protect the people that are also on the ship, the White Base, with him, against one of the best villains ever made, in my opinion, Char Aznable. And the series, I think, is a really solid entry point. Graphics, I suppose, it's not the best. It's the first one, so it's very old, right? But I do think that it's worth starting here. Give it a shot, see what you think. If you just can't stand the animation, there are compilation movies. They do leave some things out, but I think they do a good enough job of telling the story with slightly newer animation, so you can check those out as well. But that is First Gundam, and if I was to give a watch order, I would always start with First Gundam, just because I think First Gundam is really good, and it sets the stage for the rest of Universal Century. So in Gundam, there are two timelines. There's the Universal Century timeline, and then all of the other time. I guess two is not right. There's two universes. The main universe, Universal Century, and then all the other universes. And those are called alternate universes, AUs. And we'll get into which ones are AUs as we go. But my goal from this is that it'd be an easy watch video that you can come back to when you go, where does this one fall? Do I need to watch this one first or what? But First Gundam, definitely a solid recommendation to me. Starts off the Universal Century, a really, really good watch. Definitely worth giving a shot. The sequel, which is in a direct follow-up to First Gundam, it follows almost immediately. There's a little bit of an interstitiary period, but we'll get to that later, is Zeta Gundam. And Zeta Gundam is widely considered one of the best. It's my number 2 or 3, depending on the day. I love Zeta Gundam. Zeta Gundam has an incredible story. Camille Bidan, the main character, is a really solid character. It has to deal with loss. It has to deal with grief. It has some really solid action. It has, as usual for Gundam, it has people that are good on each side and bad on each side. And, you have to work through that as you get through it of, hey, maybe the people we're fighting aren't bad people all, but some of them definitely are, And so I think Zeta Gundam is absolutely worth a watch. Won't make a lot of sense to you if you don't watch First Gundam first, but you can start with Zeta if you just want to. They do explain a lot of the stuff. They just don't explain all of it. I definitely think you should watch Mobile Suit Gundam, then Zeta Gundam, but if you want to start with Zeta, you absolutely can. Things just will be out of order and might not make as much sense as they would otherwise. But very, very good show. This is followed up by Double Zeta. Double Zeta is kind of a comedy while also being a Gundam series. I don't think this is a good place to start at all. Even if you're a fan of comedy, I don't think this is like comedy anime. I don't think this is the best place to start because it requires that you know things that came before. Like it requires a lot of Zeta knowledge. And I just don't think it's that great of a show. I think, like, if you're watching everything, yeah, check it out, because there are some really solid moments in there. But there's like a 7 or 8 episode stretch that just doesn't have to be there at all with the Moon stuff. So, personally, I think this is a terrible place to start. but I do know people that have started here and they stuck with the series, so there you go. Following that is the movie Char's Counterattack. This movie is really, really good. This is a really good movie. But again, it's part of that original timeline of First Gundam, Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta Gundam. So if you jump into this movie first, nothing's going to make sense to you. None of it's going to be understandable. There's just going to be stuff happening. And maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want a movie to ease you in. You can absolutely do that. I just don't think this is where I would start personally. Very, very good movie, but don't start here, I would say. After that is 0080 War in the Pocket. So this isn't one of the interstitiary. Gundam does a lot of like what happened in the stuff you didn't see in that timeline. And 0080 is directly after First Gundam, leading into Zeta and what's going on there. And I say after, it's kind of during, but it's a 6-episode short. It's very, very good, but it also ties pretty heavily into First Gundam. So I don't know that I'd recommend starting with it either, because you kind of need some of that First Gundam knowledge to really make sense of it all. But if you just want to, you can. And it's only 6 episodes, so it's not a terrible time sink if you're unsure. But it is very much just a character drama in a lot of ways, set in the Gundam universe, and it's really, really good. Following that is F91, and F91 is a movie. And F91 is a weird recommendation because I actually think you could start with this movie. There'll be some things that don't make sense, but the majority of this movie is self-contained. F91 was originally going to be a TV series, 39 episodes, I believe, but it was turned into a movie due to development problems. And the movie itself is very quick. It's very fast. It does not waste any time because it doesn't have time to waste. But I think I think this is not a terrible place to start. I think that you could absolutely start with F91 and have a good time with it. There are definitely going to be things you don't get, and it's still part of the Universal Century timeline, but it's kind of divorced from a lot of the UC stuff that you would need to know from First Gundam, Zeta Gundam, in that it's pretty, not super distant, but it's distant into the future, so it is a separation, I guess you could say, from the rest. So if you're looking for a movie to start with, this is one to consider. After F91 is Stardust Memory, 0083. This one is kind of a tough sell to me, and also one that would be tough to start with, because again, it's in Universal Century. It deals a lot with the themes that were already going on between their Federation and Zeon. You kind of need to know what's going on there for it to really matter. You know, we're gonna back this up a little bit so you can see that logo better, which it didn't matter at all. So there we go. Yeah, it's just like it's a weird one to recommend, I think, simply because you need foreknowledge. A lot of these character motivations won't make sense to you unless you know what the asteroid Solomon is, and even then, I don't love the characters in the show. I think Gato's pretty good. If you're watching everything, and even if you're just watching Universal Century, you need to watch it. It's important for the timeline. I just don't think it's a very good place to start at all. That said, there's a character in it called South Burning that is an incredible character and a really cool fighter. So, maybe just think about that. Following that is Victory. We're still in Universal timeline at this time, Universal Century. Victory is set after Char's Counterattack. Timeline gets a little hokey in places, but it's after Char's Counterattack. There's a brand new Empire come in. You can watch this without much foreknowledge needed at all. It's kind of separate in a lot of ways, even though it's still in the Universal timeline. I would recommend watching it after seeing First Gundam, Zeta Gundam, Char's Counterattack, somewhere in there, in Universal Century timelines, but you can watch it early if you want to. It's about a kid named Uso Ewin. I guess I didn't even talk about what Stardust Memory was about. It's about a kid, Victory's about a kid named Uso Ewin that has to fight because the Zanskare Empire is dominating everyone and cutting off people's heads, and it's pretty dark, actually. There's a lot of character death in it, so just be prepared for that. Following that is G Gundam. G Gundam is the first show set in an alternate universe. It has nothing to do with Universal Century at all. Zeon never existed. This is a brand new timeline. In this timeline, every country, I almost said every continent, every country has a Gundam fighter and a Gundam, and they have a big tournament every year or every 4 years. I don't remember exactly which, but they have a big tournament, and whoever wins the tournament, that country is in control. That country's in charge until the next tournament. So it's a pretty cool setup for the world. And then in the middle of all this, you have Domokashu trying to find that man. It's a very crazy show in a lot of ways. He's very super robot, whereas a lot of Gundam is real robot. But I love G Gundam. G Gundam is so much fun. You could absolutely start with G Gundam because it's an alternate universe. Just know going in that a lot of the rest of Gundam is not this. That's the one thing I would say if you start with G Gundam. The next one's Gundam Wing. This is a show that a lot of people started with because of Toonami. Gundam Wing is also in an alternate universe. It tells the story of an Earth that has 5 Gundams come down to Earth with the intention of sparking a war. And you have 5 very different Gundam pilots that all have these very different Gundams. And it's actually got a really solid story. I like the characters. Animation's a little dated now, in the same way that all of these are, right? They came out in the 90s and early 80s and late 80s, I guess. But I still think it looks really good. Definitely worth a watch, in my opinion. The story in Wing is not as solid as some of the other options, but it's absolutely an option if you just, hey, I want to start somewhere. People always talk good about Wing because people do. Wing is still really well beloved. Check it out. It's definitely a good place to start. Following that was 08th MS Team. I'm doing these in release order, by the way. I don't know if I made that clear. 08th MS Team is back in the Universal Century and takes place, I think it's right after or right at the end of First Gundam, leading into Zeta. It's a really solid show that unfortunately kind of falls apart towards the end because of a director change that was nobody's fault. The previous director passed away in a very unfortunate accident. But the show does definitely change gears towards the end there. But it's still a really solid show. It has one of the best fights in all of Gundam. You could start here. There would be some things that wouldn't make sense to you. Zeon and the Federation, you just kind of got to follow along pretty quick. But you can start here. It's pretty much segregated from the rest of the series. But people love it. It's really, really solid. Following 08th MS Team is Gundam X. This is another alternate universe series. This one is actually relatively short, too, and is going to explain new types to you, even if you don't watch original Gundam, which I didn't even talk about new types there. I believe this is one of the few AUs to have new types in it as well, which is really interesting. But this is a really solid show to start with as well. It can be hard to find nowadays. It never got an official release over here, so you have to turn to unofficial venues if you want to watch it. But I think it's still a really solid show. Garrett is a really fun protagonist, and hey, he's just a scrapper trying to get by in the world. And he meets this girl, and then everything changes for them. So I think that X is a really solid place to start as well. It's pretty short, but in some ways that makes it an even better place to start, right? Following that is Turn A Gundam. Now, Turn A is also maybe in a separate timeline, but it also might be after the UC timeline ends. It's kind of tough to stuff. There's some I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm being clear. I'm being vague, I guess. The opposite of clear. You would benefit from green screen. We were so close, man. I talked about it earlier, how much of a problem it had become. There are some things that, like, references that you won't get if you haven't seen original Gundam, but you can absolutely watch Turn A without having seen the rest if you want. Turn A is about Laurent Sehak, a man from the moon, because there's the moon race in this series, who comes down to Earth, and then the moon and the Earth go to war, and he has to try and choose between his old home and his new home. And the decisions that he makes along the way, I think, are really, really powerful. I think it's a great series. It is my favorite Gundam series. And again, it's a place you could start. You won't get all the references, but I think it's a pretty good starting point, honestly. Mostly because it's kind of separate in a way. Also, it has incredible music. I forgot to mention that part. It has incredible music. Following that is Gundam Seed. Gundam Seed is another alternate universe show. It is almost like a soft reboot of original Gundam in a way. It definitely goes for the same kind of vibe, but also introduces some new themes that I think are pretty good. Gundam Seed, I think, is a pretty solid show about a guy named Kira Yamato who is forced to fight against his old friend Athrin Zala and Athrin's new friends. Seed is a fine place to start. I know a lot of people who started at Seed. The problem with Seed is not even really with Seed itself. Seed does have some weird stuff that happens in it, but I think Seed, is, for the most part, is pretty good. The problem is Destiny, which is the sequel to Seed. Destiny is really, really weird. It starts off really solid and a great follow-up to Seed, and then it just falls apart. And it's why Seed is a tough recommendation for where to start, because I don't want you to watch Seed and go, man, I love this, let me watch the sequel, and then watch Destiny and go, Gundam's garbage. Because a lot of people have. So, Seed itself, fine. That is a fine place to start. Destiny, I do not recommend you start with Destiny. First off, you need to have watched Seed to understand what's going on in Destiny. Also, I don't think Destiny is very good. But Seed is a fine place to start. It's not terrible. I think the music in Seed is really, really good. I think some of the action in Seed is really, really good. Just stay away from you know what? Try Destiny if you want to, right? But just know most of Gundam is not like that. Most of Gundam is not like that. Man, I wanted Destiny to be good so bad. The first half of Destiny is really, really solid. It's really good. We'll move on. Next up is Gundam 00. 00 is a fan favorite in a lot of ways. It is Gundam in a weird way. Like it perfectly encapsulates all the good and all the bad about Gundam, in my opinion, in one show, which is pretty crazy. I think 00 is a great place to start because it gives you a great idea of what happens in Gundam shows. It gives you a great idea of what to expect, while also being a really solid show in its own right. Season 1 of 00 is some of the best of Gundam. Season 2 of 00 is good Gundam. It's like not great, but it's good, right? And then the movie is absolutely terrible. So it gives you the Gundam experience, you know? But jokes aside, I think 00 is a great place to start. I know a lot of people that have started with 00. Very, very good show. Very, very solid. Great characters and stuff that you will remember, you know, stuff that will stick with you and hopefully make you want to watch more Gundam. Following 00 is Unicorn. And Unicorn's an interesting one. It is back in the Universal Century timeline, which it had been a while since we got a UC show when Unicorn came out. So it's back in the first Gundam timeline following that. And there's two different ways to watch it. You can watch the OVA, which is 7 40-minute episodes, 45-ish minute episodes, or you can watch the anime, which is 22 22-minute episodes. And so the anime obviously has more time, but it started as an OVA. So it's really up to you which one you want to start with. I don't recommend starting with Unicorn, even though Unicorn in a lot of ways is some of the best looking that Gundam has ever been. Because Unicorn does rely on you knowing what new types are, knowing what cyber new types are, knowing what is going on with Char from the original series. All of that is important for Unicorn, so I don't recommend starting with Unicorn, even though I think it's a very, very good show. Following Unicorn is Age. Age is in another alternate reality, another alternate universe. Age is a tough recommendation. I think you could start with Age, right? It's a very interesting show, but I don't think it'll give you a solid understanding of what Gundam is, because Age is a generational show. You have 3 different generations, with each main character taking up their own generation, and I don't think the later generations are very good. The first generation is incredible. It's so good. The second generation is all right, and the third generation is wow. What did you do? I can't, even as much as I love Age, because I do. I love that first generation of Age so much that Age is up there for me. But I cannot in good conscience say, yeah, you should watch Age as your first Gundam show, because you will not watch more Gundam if you watch Age first, which is just a huge shame. Just start somewhere else. I mean, if you just want to, but just remember, it's not emblematic of the rest of Gundam. Following that is Gundam Build Fighters, which is also not emblematic of the rest of Gundam, but I think is actually a weird, good place to start if you've never seen Gundam. Gundam Build Fighters is a show set in our world-ish, where Gundam is an anime, and they build the model kits to fight with them in a video game, which is really cool. It's separated in a lot of ways from Gundam, but references a lot of other Gundam. So obviously watching it after you've seen a lot of Gundam will enhance the experience, but you could absolutely watch it, watch a bunch of other Gundam, and then come back and appreciate it more, I think. Because it does stand on its own. I think Build Fighters is a really, really good place to start if you're unsure on where to start. And after the end of this, I'll go back and say my recommended places to start. But Build Fighters is definitely one of them. Very, very cool show. Following that is Gundam Reconquista NG. Reconquista NG, I don't think is a very good place to start, because this show is also not emblematic of a lot of other Gundam series. It's very different. It's very experimental. It tries some things, and whether it lands on those things or not is up to the interpretation. But it is set after the end of the Universal Century. It is very quick. The plot moves incredibly fast, and it can be very hard to keep up with. I do not recommend the show for new Gundam viewers at all. I don't hate G-Reco, but G-Reco is a tough watch on the first watch. The second watch is a whole lot better, but that first watch is tough. There are some compilation movies, that's the word, coming out that may make it better, but I still don't think it'll be a great place to start, even though some of the music is really, really good. Following that, the green screen's falling down again. Following that is Gundam Build Fighters Try, which is the sequel to Build Fighters. You definitely shouldn't start with Try, because Try is the follow-up to Build Fighters, and it will make no sense if you haven't seen Build Fighters. You can do it, but I don't recommend it at all. It ties into Build Fighters in a big way, honestly. It's kind of important that you have seen Build Fighters first. But it is about three characters that are trying to win a tournament in the Build Fighters world. And it's pretty good. It's not incredible to me, but I wouldn't start there. Gundam The Origin is the start of Char's story. I don't know that it was needed, but it's definitely good. And in a weird way, you could start here. It expects you to know First Gundam, but it also is a prequel to First Gundam in some ways. So you absolutely could start here and you would be all right. You would be able to flow straight from that into First Gundam. That said, it uses a lot of CG. That can take a little bit to get used to, because most of Gundam does not use CG. But still a really solid place to start, I think, because it gives you the backstory on Char, and then you can go straight into First Gundam. Following that is Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans. This is a really solid place to start because it's an alternate universe that's very new. So the graphics it's very pretty, I guess is the way to put it. It's done up in the newer styles. Not a lot of CG used, though there is a little bit. Very, very good show to start with, I think. It's a lot of my friends' favorite, but that doesn't mean it's going to be yours. Everybody's different, right? But I think it's a very, very solid place to start. I think Season 2 is not as good as Season 1 in some ways, and then towards the end of Season 2, it becomes better than Season 1 in some ways. But I do think it is a very, very solid place to start. It is about a team of orphans that, go figure, right, with the title, that war orphans, I guess you could say, that are living on Mars and are basically slaves, but are able to rise up and make their own mercenary group. And it's a pretty good watch. It's dark in some ways too, kind of like Victory, but I think that it is still worth checking out, especially if you're going, where do I start? This is a really, really solid place to start. Another really, really solid place to start is Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt is set in the Universal Century timeline, but you don't really need to know anything other than, hey, Zeon versus the Federation. These are the two factions. Let's go. Visually, it's a very impressive show. They do a lot with lightning that I think is really cool. The characters, none of them are necessarily good people, but I think that only like shows you what Gundam is normally like, right? Then you have the action, which is intense and really, really good, and the music, which is really, really good. Plus, it's short. It's only a handful of episodes. You'll be able to burn through it pretty quickly. And I absolutely think it's one of the best places to start in Gundam because you don't need to know anything about it to get into it. You just need to know that, hey, there's a Gundam and there's a Zaku, and then let's go. Very, very solid show. Very, very good place to start. Following that is Gundam Build Divers. I'll be honest, this is the first Gundam show I've ever dropped. I intend to go back to it because I want to watch the sequel that I hear is better. Re-Rise. Re-Rise looks like this, by the way. But this is set roughly in the Build Fighters world, but where in the future of it, where now you have a full-on Gundam VR MMO. And you may say, well, Trey, why would you drop that? That seems incredible. I didn't like the characters at all. But I want to go back and give it another shot. That said, I do think if you're a big fan of like isekais or MMO anime, this is probably a good place to start because it does that. You know, your characters have to get stronger. You have all these fantasy races that they could choose to be. So it's definitely a good entry point if you're into that style of anime. I just didn't like the writing that much, but I will go back and finish it at some point. There's also the SD shows. We have Sengokuden Brave Battle Warriors, which is like the Three Kingdoms version of Romance of Three Kingdoms, that is, of SD Gundam. Have not seen it yet myself because I'm not a huge fan of the CG, though I will go back and watch it for the sake that it's Romance of Three Kingdoms. But maybe give it a shot. Might be a good place to start. You have SD Gundam Force that came out some time back. Originally was dubbed and I believe put on Toonami. But I hear that it's also really solid in the original sub. It's really strange. It's really strange. But if you're a fan of like, hey, weird stuff's happening, let's go. It might be a good place to start as well. There's also the movies. Gundam Wing Endless Waltz. Gundam 00, Awakening of the Trailblazer. Mobile Suit Gundam Narrative, which is the Unicorn movie, and Mobile Suit Gundam Twilight Axis. I don't think you should start with any of these movies. First off, because Twilight Axis moves way too fast. At the time of this, I had not seen it. I have seen it now. It moves way too fast. But also because narrative requires you to know what's going on in Gundam Unicorn. Not like to a huge degree, not to the way the other two that we're going to talk about do, but you still should know. Awakening of the Trailblazer absolutely requires you have seen 00 first. And Endless Waltz absolutely requires you've seen Gundam Wing first. So you shouldn't start with any of those, in my opinion. We also have Gundam San, which is a comedy show about First Gundam. It's definitely made better if you've seen original Gundam, but you can kind of get away with watching this first, though I don't recommend it per se. We also have Evolve. Evolve requires you to have seen First Gundam, Zeta Gundam, Char's Counterattack, and a little bit of Double Zeta for all of it to make sense. So definitely don't start there. Igloo requires you to know Universal Century, like First Gundam, Zeta Gundam, Char's Counterattack, a little bit of Double Zeta. Again, don't start here. And then Stargazer is set in the Seed universe, so you should probably have seen Seed and Seed Destiny if you plan on watching that. There's also the Gunpla Builders Beginning G show, which is a like prequel OVA to Build Fighters. It's where the idea came from. And Mobile Suit Gundam G Savior, the movie, one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Definitely don't start there. But let's say you don't want to start with an anime, you want to start with a manga. You can do that too. There are Gundam manga that are really, really good. You could start with a manga if you want to. École du Ciel is part romance, part like shoujo style, but also very much still Gundam. A very good read. You have Gundam Seed Astray, very hard to find, but a very good read set in the Seed universe. You have Gundam 00F, which is set in the 00 universe. about a character named Fawn and Spark. Very, very solid. You have Mobile Suit Gundam: A Side Story Missing Link, which is set during the original Mobile Suit Gundam Universal Century timeline. You have Crossbone, which is set in the F91 future. And then a bunch of other shorts and side stories. The Johnny Ridden manga that's set in the original Mobile Suit Gundam franchise universe. So, where do I think people should start? I think your best options are Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt, Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, Mobile Suit Gundam Build Fighters. We're going to keep scrolling up here. Mobile Suit Gundam 00, and Mobile Suit Gundam Wing. I think those 5 are my recommendations for where you should start, unless you want to go all in on the Universal or Century timeline, in which case, hey, start with Original Gundam. It's still really, really good. Or Char's Counterattack. Both of those are options. I think these are the easiest 6, I guess, to get into. Wing is a big, popular show set in its own universe. Very self-contained. 00 in the same way. Build Fighters is its own thing and really fun. And, hey, we're just having a good time. Thunderbolt is really, really solid. Very short. A great place to start. And IBO is new. Very pretty, with some really good writing and some really good action and some really good music. And then First Gundam is the start, right? It's like the beginning. You can start at any of these shows. Disregard my advice if you'd like to. Thanks for sticking around with me as you did. Let me know in the comment section down below other series that you'd like to see me talk about this with, where to start. But let me know, where did you start Gundam? What was your first Gundam show? And until next time, I've been Trey. This has been The Full Spectrum. Remember to always enjoy the full spectrum that Gundam has to offer.